Race course വണ്ടി വരുമോ?
嗰度都牛屎啊！唔追啊唔追。
3年前，咁保險啦。
咁近，幾多人過去啊？好嘛？
什麼意思啊？你有鐳不賣炭啊？
哇！你攞住咁多嘢好重噶嘛？如果我追你，你會唔會俾我充倍價錢啊？唔會啊嘛，係咪先？係啊，唔做啊咁樣，我去休息啊。
少年家，你頭頭要落山咧休息。
誒，休息是為了要行更長遠的路，有冇聽過啊？誒，你都唔識噶啦，走，唔好阻住我休息啊！
今日咧，我要同大家講一個古仔。呢個古仔咧，一個叫做車生嘅。佢屋企咧唔係好有錢嘅喎，但係有一個嗜好就係好中意飲酒，尤其是喺晚上啊，如果唔飲得3大杯嘅話咧，佢唔瞓得覺㗎。所以床上咧全部都係酒情嚟㗎。有一個晚上咧，車生咧飲咗酒咧就瞓喺個床嗰度喎，瞓到冇幾耐咧，你發覺到有一個人瞓喺個邊皮嗰度喎，咁佢就用手去摸咯，咦？點解摸有啲毛嘅？越摸而有毛嘅，佢以為係貓嚟嘅喎，但係比個貓仲大隻喎，所以仲有個油燈咧去照一照睇喎，你哋猜係咩嚟嘅？原來係一隻狐狸嚟㗎，嗰隻狐狸咧瞓到好似死開咁嘅樣喎，叫佢都唔醒喎，所以車生咧就唔敢嘈醒佢，由佢繼續瞓。咁到半夜冇幾耐咧，就睇到呢個狐狸喐嚟喐去喎，咁佢又揭開嗰個氈嚟睇咧，喂，唔見咗狐狸喎，原來變咗個咩啊？變咗個好靚仔嘅男仔喎。
你好，我係廢子。
手腕。
Siapa nama kamu? Di mana awak tinggal?
This painting, titled Trishaw Rider, was painted by Lai Foong Moi in 1961. What's so interesting about this is that it depicts a Trishaw rider outside our conventional image of what a Trishaw rider usually looks like. He's depicted here in a moment of rest and outside of his profession of ferrying people about the city. What stands out to me when I look at this painting closer is the inclusion of quite a curious object, which the Trishaw rider has in his hand, and it's actually a nose flute. And I think that Lai Foong Moi's inclusion of this quite whimsical detail really allows us to imagine a world for the Trishaw rider beyond his profession and to think about him in his private moments.
入邊咧嚟一個女仔喎，個女仔咧大約係24、25歲左右啦。佢嘅背後咧孭住個大嘅布囊喎，布囊入邊咧裝滿晒啲藥材。呢個女仔咧打算就入嗰個村入邊咧幫嗰啲村民睇病。嗰啲村民睇到呢個女仔嚟喎，就行緊住問佢講喎：，唉，醫生啊，幫我哋睇病啦！但係嗰個女仔講唔得啊，我唔可以咁樣幫你哋開藥方嚟㗎。我要等到夜晚黑咧，我要問過咧嗰啲神仙啊，先至批准啊，先可以幫你哋睇病㗎。咁你哋夜晚先24、25歲左右啦。佢個背後咧呢條大嘅布囊喎，布囊入邊咧。
你咁奇怪嘅，咁樣吹笛㗎？
呢個唔係奇怪， 呢個係有性格。你好，我係廢子。
手碗
一對廢子一個碗，係咪即係話一定要一齊食飯咁解啊？
Lai Foong Moi, who passed away in 1994, was very interested in depicting people in their everyday lives. And more often than not, she would depict labourers, and she tended to focus not on the production or the activity of their labour, but really focus on them as individuals and as human beings going about their lives within society. In the 50s and 60s, many of the artists who were contemporaneous with Lai Foong Moi all began to take a very concerted interest in depicting everyday Singaporeans or everyday Malayans. And this was sort of in tandem with a growing move towards nationalism and nation building. So as part of that, many of their subjects and many of the places that they drew inspiration from were sort of these everyday scenes, which more often than not would include these labourers. Through these paintings, the artists sought to capture not just their struggles, but their hopes, dreams, and aspirations.
早期的新加坡人大部分都是比较低阶层的比较多，属于劳动阶级。码头工人啊，搬运工人啊，做一些罗里车夫啦，驾的士啦，商人车夫啦，是相当普遍的一种现象啦。这个是那个时候的需要。早期他们的这些勤劳的工作。 热情的推动这个社会啦，这些工人应该不要忘记他们对新加坡的发展，他们对这个社会的贡献。
In the 1960s and the 1970s, as the Singapore government tried to industrialize and build factories and all these, there were still parts of the economy that had to be sustained by labor of a different kind. They were not highly skilled, semi-skilled, but of an informal sort. You know, these people could be daily rated, they could just go in to fill certain gaps. And these were in the sectors of infrastructure building, for instance, road building, building of houses, so construction. And then of course hawkers, and the transport industry was another one. You know, you had pirate taxis that plied the streets to provide transportation services. And you know, you had a lot of these services that were provided by people who did not have shops or did not have a place for business. So I remember my hair was being cut by a barber who came on a bicycle. Every 3 weeks or so, he'll ride by and then he'll ask, you all need to cut a hair. And me and my brother and my uncles will be sitting in a row waiting to have a haircut.
1964年代之前也是这样，新加坡到处小贩、街贩很多。这个是在牛车水拍的照片，他们是在卖假药。住在牛车水的人，大多数都是劳动阶级，苦力，所受的教育都是很浅的，很少的。所以呢，我们看到牛车水也有一些像这样专门替人家写家书，还有写那个联对联。那么这个就是在牛车水走廊那边有一摊在替人家写家书。所以我是觉得说， 他们也能够在这样的过他的日子，也替人家写，也替人家说书讲解。
You know, for most of the working class, their lives really revolve around the streets. And at that time, the streets were full of noise and life and had a lot of really interesting sounds. You could also hear other things like Indian music and Malay music in the streets. The other thing I want to mention about the sounds is that during the seventh moon, you had real Chinese opera. It would be either Hokkien or Teochew or Cantonese, and I could see Chinese opera just sitting in the back of my house, really. So all that was very much in evidence. And you know, you had traveling musical troupes. You had people with, who would come with a kucheng or a yangqin and erhu and play around the coffee shops and all that for a few cents. So the street sounds were sort of more colorful than they are today. And I sort of regret that we don't have street music today.
Indian Worker at Kallang River, painted in 1973, is quite an interesting work because it shows us an alternative view to the Singapore River and Singapore's various waterways and ports, where they are usually portrayed in quite picturesque ways and used as symbols of Singapore's economic viability and sort of as a bustling port city. In this painting, Koeh Sia Yong shows us the human labour which underpins all of this progress by depicting several Indian workers cleaning a boat which is docked by Kallang River.
So for many years, since the mid-19th century, Singapore was a transportation centre. So 1820s, 1830s, after Singapore became a British colony, they transported these Indian convicts to Singapore. So they started building, like St. Andrew's Cathedral, the Istana, City Hall. So they were responsible for building these huge monuments in Singapore. Now, when their terms ended, some of them went back and then some stayed in Singapore, but they tended to dominate the Public Works Division, the PWD as they were called. So every time the PWD had construction, these people would come forth. So building roads, sometimes building water facilities, construction. So they tended to be very visible in that kind of industry, the Indians.
Road Construction Worker was painted in 1955 by Chua Mia Tee. In this portrait, we see immediately quite a different perspective of the sitter. He's seated quite firmly on the ground, and it's quite a departure from the conventions of traditional portraiture, which was usually limited to elite classes and usually done within sort of closed studio settings. So in Chua Mia Tee's work, the sitter is firstly seated on the floor, but also outside. So we really get a sense that the artist is trying to suggest that we take notice of these individuals who might be around us, who are very much a part of our society and are contributing members as well, of their daily lived experience, which, as we can see from the sitter's emaciated form, is quite hard physically as well.
we tend to attribute the building of Singapore to just policies and politicians. There's no question about that. Leadership, sound policies, and political stability, all this contributed to bringing Singapore to where we are today. But actually Singapore is also built on the backs of individuals who contributed many parts in construction, in building infrastructure, in education, in providing healthcare, and in providing trade and services to make Singapore viable. So these individual stories are, in my view, very important, often forgotten because they're not recorded and not documented and nobody talks about them. The stories are sometimes stories of tremendous hardship, stories of sacrifices, stories of toil and things that they have lost, families and all this. But I think they contribute to, a larger story of Singapore from the ground up.
係咧，你好中意聽人哋講古㗎？
係啊，你識唔識講啊？講一個嚟聽下。
不過我就識得講自己嘅古仔啫喎。
你講啊。
好。咁就從前咧有一個靚仔，佢叫做廢子，咁即係我啦嚇。咁就佢阿爸阿媽咧就死得早喎。好彩佢仲有一個阿叔養大佢。不過後尾咧，佢阿叔又死埋喎。還好，佢阿叔臨走之前咧，仲有留翻一個生意俾佢。
咩生意啊？
做嘢咯，即係包括人啊、貨啊咁啊。你好似由呢度再貨去另外一個地方嗰種咧，
即係運輸公司啦。
係啊，可以咁講啦。好麻煩㗎，成日都要走嚟走去㗎。咁你咧，仲讀緊書㗎？好啊，讀書好啊！哇，你一定係識講英文咯！哇，咁樣你又咪可以喺嗰啲有冷氣嘅地方做工？好啊，有前途啊！好啊！
除咗平時吹你嗰個咁奇怪嘅笛之外，你仲中意做啲乜㗎？
踩腳車咯。係啊，我中意踩腳車㗎。你咧？
我除咗聽古仔之外，冇乜時間做其他嘢㗎。
咁你仲有冇時間同我食餐飯啊？
呢一餐都仲未食完，咁快講下一餐嘢？
男人一定要為將來着想㗎嘛，係咪先？食啊食。
In the 50s and the 60s, Singapore was a sort of completely different entity from what it is today. Life was really, really very simple. Imagine a Singapore with no television, no internet. Housing for most people, except the very rich, was very basic, Many people lived in kampongs and actually were living a sort of happy life.
以前路边一段一段都有一些公共的水沟嘛，然后你要冲凉、要洗澡要饮水都是去那边挑用桶去挑。
这个照片就是我在 Lorong Tree Geylang Lorong Tree 那边拍的。那么这个照片我是看到他们在路边的水龙头那边冲凉，这个母亲是替她的孩子在冲凉。那个时代看起来新加坡还是很贫穷的，很多地方都是很落后的，所以看到新加坡很多地方人们的生活都是穷的，是很穷的。
Potong Pasir dairy farmer was painted in 1958 by the artist Lee Boon Wang. And what captures our attention immediately is really the close perspective that the artist has taken on this subject's sort of weather-beaten face. And what stands out a lot is the technical finesse in which the artist has chosen to capture all the fine lines and wrinkles on this subject's face. I think when we look at this painting, it's quite an immediate emotional response. Looking at the condition of his skin, as well as the emotion that the artist is evoking through his eyes, there is a certain empathy that the viewer is able to receive and feel when looking at this portrait.
1955年，我住在雅龙市内。早期就是以务农。 养鸡、养鸭、养猪，还有很多人种菜。种菜浇的什么肥？大便。他们养鸭怎么养？就去那个粪池里面舀那个虫去喂鸭子，很惊人的哈。
When I was in school, we used to have these fun fairs. So the fun fair was a school fundraising effort, but also to bring families together. And you know, in the fun fair you had games like darts throwing, ping pong balls in cups and all sort of thing. And we would go around the neighborhood asking people to see whether they could donate in cash or kind. And I remember one farmer donated ducks, and we had a pen in one part of the school where there were some ducks just moving around, and you threw a hoop, and if the hoop landed on the neck of a duck, you took the duck home. But that was because of where we were, in Aukang, where people were still rearing chickens and ducks, and they donated ducks as part of an effort to contribute to the school.
小时候印象最深的就是在大水沟里游泳，下大雨的时候、淹水的时候就跳进大水沟里面。偶尔上游飘来只死猪，你就把它推掉；有几只死鸡把它推掉继续游。没有卫生，没有什么
For the first, I don't know how many years of my life, I had no modern sanitation. I don't know whether people here understand what it means by no modern sanitation, no flush toilet. So every few days, a lorry with a lot of doors would come along, and these guys would come and take away your stuff from your no modern sanitation toilet, you know. It was only when I was 10 or 11, probably that modern sanitation was installed, and for people like me who had never seen modern sanitation, it was a miracle that you know, you could pull the lever and all that stuff would be flushed down with water. It was a squat toilet anyway. There were no such things as sitting toilets in those days.
'60年代、70年代，尤其是60年代，我们的教育水平也不高，很多小朋友都是读到小学啦、毕业啦，有些甚至是比较早都不想读书。我上学是到 5年级，差不多10岁、11岁，我就没上学了。然后我妈妈就叫我，这样不读书就要去学一门手艺，叫我去学电法啦，还是裁缝。结果我就选去做裁缝。在我的印象中，就是这几样而已了。好像家用，以前的家用不是现在的，有越南啊，有菲律宾啊，有印尼的。以前就是没有，新加坡就是找新加坡。那时候你可以去屋主那边去做去住。那时候我侧翼的工资才1个月40块而已，那个年代就是这样而已，很好了。那时候我侧翼从早上8点做到晚上8点。连吃他的2餐这样又走路回，那是工资是40块的。做家庭工也是这样的，家庭40块、45块，没有受教育的比较多的工作就是这样。如果可以读到中学呢，那些可能做秘书啦、经理啦，那些比较智慧比较高尚一点的。
喂，啱啱老闆仲揾你啊！你最好咧就趁而家佢仲未捉到你之前，快啲換咗件衫啦。其實咧唔係你件衫，你根本就唔應該着。
我都係借下嚟着下啫嘛。況且，如果我睇到幾件衫咧穿咗個窿，或者係爛咗，我都會補翻去，當係補翻數咯。絕對唔會佔人便宜㗎。
咁你啱啱去咗邊啫？着得咁靚，又笑得咁開心返嚟嘅？
冇去邊啊？聽人講故仔啫嘛。
講故仔？咩故仔啊？愛情故仔啊？
我去做嘢先。
Before the factories came on board in full swing and started employing women into the factory floors, I think most women who worked were involved in the informal sectors. So they served as maybe midwives, they work in hair salons, massage parlors, or supporting their hawker husbands or whatever. So I think that's why they are not as visible in the workforce. So they worked in the informal sector.
Labourer Lunch Break was painted in 1965 by Lai Foong Moi. What we see immediately when we look at the painting is a gentleman who is seated facing towards us. He's wearing a white shirt and a blue jacket, and we can make an inference that he might be some kind of coolie or labourer. And he seems to be the main subject of the painting. But as we take a closer look, we can see within the same central sightline a figure whose back is turned to us, and we can identify her pretty immediately because of the red starched cap that she has on, and we know her to be a Samsui woman and a worker as well.
I think Samsui women are really tough, characters, because basically you're talking about, almost middle-aged women in the working industry. They also have that equal status in terms of the nation building. But she was left in the backdrop. And I guess this is how she felt about how the woman is positioned within society itself.
I think the painting is quite ambiguous, and that's what makes it so interesting, and it can be read really in quite a few different ways. One way to approach the painting is to think about what Lai Foong Moi might be suggesting about the experience of labourers in general. She chooses here to focus on two individuals from a particular segment of society, which perhaps is less visible or kind of less prominent. And she's focusing here on their moment of rest again, emphasizing their humanity, the need to take a break in the middle of a long day. By sort of concealing the woman's identity from us, she's also differentiating the experience between male labourers and female labourers. And perhaps she's pointing towards the slightly more anonymous experience of female labourers.
Madam Lai was my lecturer for drawing for almost 3 years when I enrolled into Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts in 1983. Madam Lai contributed quite significantly, not just in terms of the art field, but also in education.
What I like about Lai Foong Moi is a real sense of sincerity and authenticity that seems to come across very clearly, especially when looking at her paintings of portraits or paintings of various sitters. There is always a sense of an inner world in many of the subjects that she depicts. It's not just about formal concerns or kind of recording these individuals that she's come across, but there really is a kind of interesting narrative that is often quite ambiguous, that always draws me in and intrigues me and makes me want to look at the paintings for a very long time.
Khai檔啦！
係啊，誒，着得咁靚，你梗係見一個好重要嘅人啦。
你日日喺度講古仔，啲古仔全部都係假嘅，講大話賺錢，你驚唔驚啊？
點解你認為我講大話賺錢呢？其實假嘅入邊都有真㗎。
咁深，聽唔明。
你仲年輕。
好靚啊！你條裙好靚啊！係咯，你條裙咯。
你着翻同一套衫嘅？
哦，我有換㗎，不過你唔覺啫嘛。我有7套咁嘅衫，一日一套，代表咩啊？忠心。
你架車啊？
嗯。
你嘅司機？
嗯哼。
我哋去邊度食飯啊？
你識講英文㗎嘛？我哋去食西餐。
其實我唔中意食西餐嘅。
哦，唔食西餐唔緊要，我哋去食中餐，好嘛？領女請。做咩呢個手咁？
我。
Ikan, apa yang berlaku ni?
Encik Ahmad.
Macam mana kereta ni dari sini? Tu baju tu. Macam mana awak pakai baju studio?
Saya mau juga kereta.
Siapa yang bagi awak kebenaran? Yang awak pergi hantar sekarang?
Iya.
Sekarang juga.
这个照片就是在马达伊干拍的。马达伊干呢，也就是新加坡樟宜机场的这个地方，以前都是海边，现在变成陆地了。靠近马达伊干的这些人都是靠海生活，做铸造的工作。尤其这一张，他是靠什么呢？去捞那个蚌壳，拿来烧来做灰水，来卖给灰水山，给人家游灰水。有一个年轻人 要见我，因为他有和我买了几张收藏。他说这个是他的公公，然后我觉得很感动，我感觉到说我们拍这个是很有意义，让那些现在的人去看过去的人是怎么生活的，和现在的人是不一样的，很辛苦。到海边去啊，看到很多形形色色的的人的生活。那是2个孩子在海边收拾这个海草，作为养猪用的。当时的小孩子都在工作，一边可能读书，一边要工作，像我一样的。以前我也是这样，上课完了就书包放在旁边就要做工。
7岁、13岁，我就出去帮人家打工，我做很多工作，帮人家捧面啊，后来去帮人家做鱼圆啊，然后在巴沙卖鱼啊、卖菜啊、卖猪肉啊、卖干粮啊，都做过。就是我年轻童年的时候。65年后，新加坡发展得快，
大家都要换工作了，要开始一种提高质量低下的工作，比如说搬这个东西，或者是海边捞那个蚌壳，以及新加坡河的那个搬运，这些工业呢都开始没落了。那个改变很快，这个是我的感觉，就变化很快。
长大后，我的工作很多样，木匠啊、油漆啊、水泥匠啊、白冰啊、电工啊、烧焊啊，那个电梯啊、升降机的装饰与维修啊，我都做过。我敢去做，敢去尝试。我去做那个 lift installation 的时候，我需要画一些 blanket 啊什么要去 order， 然后不做没办法，我就再去 British School 上一个 mechanic drawing。我学英语是逼我去学，我做这个 radiation protection， 就是 X-ray room 啊，然后每天我的 client 就是讲英语。没办法就学一些一天一句一天1句2句学久了就能讲一些，然后最终我就是做 radiation protection 做了30几年，要到40年。
From the 1960s onwards, there were these technical schools that were built up in Singapore. So there were more opportunities created in the schools for technical education. So things like electrical wiring, motor car repairs, ship welding and all those were skills that I think was needed at the time to support different industries.
Workers in the Canteen was painted in 1974 by Chua Mia Tee.
And it is based on the lunchtime scene at Jurong Shipyard. It shows the working class within the more industrial context of the 1970s. What is most interesting to me is actually Chua Mia Tee's use of lighting. It's quite dramatic and it almost reminds us of a Renaissance painting where there's quite heavy use of light and shadow and there's a lot of contrast. And what is very striking is that each of the figures' faces are also very clearly individuated by Chua Mia Tee. So you can almost identify each of them not as sort of a collective of workers, or there is no sense of the worker as an anonymous figure, but really a very strong statement about the experience of each individual worker in this scene. All of these paintings looking at the subject of labourers remain very relevant today because they signpost a very specific time in our history, both art historically and socially.
It is a good reminder that Singapore did not happen by chance, that we didn't inherit all these things, but they had to be built, and people built them. People from all walks of life built them. But it also showed how times have changed, right? Because how many of these people do you see in the streets today? You do see them, but they are no longer locals, Our construction industry is now predominantly imported workers from South Asia. So you see the change now, and in a sense, Singaporeans have moved up the value chain. They don't do these things anymore. Is that good or bad is something that we can talk about, but the point is that the history has changed and our social profile has changed. If you look at the paintings, they're so vivid, right? They capture the furrows, the sweat. And this is actually a good reminder that we shouldn't treat our labouring colleagues as invisible. They are there to perform a very important function for Singapore. And it would be very sad if Singaporeans say, oh, this is an invisible part of Singapore, I don't wish to see. They are there, but I don't wish to see. I think there has to be some recognition. There has to be some appreciation of how these people are making the kinds of sacrifices those people made in the 50s and 60s to contribute to Singapore.
Cái場啊？
唔再啊！
Yang baru?
我唔再啦。
Let's go ke rumah.
Okey, lajunya kamu bawa. Terima kasih ya.
Kampung silat. Sila.
小劉嚟，上車，嚟。
係啦，呢個休息嘛。
係啊，今日唔使休息啊，嚟啦，上車啦，快啲。
我唔驚真醉咧，真凍啊。
係冇問題啦，快啲嚟上車。
我冇好啲生背女啊。
唔緊要啦。
真係啊。
唔好意思，有事啊。
死哪裡？我掠着，我甲你講這個，互你淹死啊，淹袂死啊，甲你拖去捌就車站啊，捌甲你弄死啊。
3日後嚟拎啊！
你喺度做咩啊？你嚟笑我啊？
嚟揾你啦！
你嚟揾我做咩啫？我只不過都係一個洗衫妹，我嘅手啊好粗㗎。
我只不過都係一個三腳車司機啫。
所以我哋兩個都係騙子。之前講嘅一切，所有都係假嘅。走開啊！兩個騙子行埋一齊係冇未來㗎。
係，我哋所講嘅一切都係假嘅，但唔代表以後唔會成真喎。你知道嘛？我而家每日都努力，因為我相信有一日我要儲夠錢買一架有冷氣嘅車。今日我係三腳車司機，聽日我就係的士司機。你呢？ 唔通打算一直着人哋嘅領衫，過埋下半世噶咯
我啊一直以嚟都有學點樣車衫，好快就可以做自己嘅生意。我自己都識整領衫。
幾時？
好快啦！我老師已經將佢嘅舊車衫機賣俾我，我一去拎啊就可以開始噶啦。
佢住喺邊？
好遠啊！
上車。
今日好熱喎。
我慣咗噶啦。
上嚟上。你中意我啊？
少少啊。